Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 41, A Bit Odd. Ethan noticed it first. It was hard not to notice, really, and he was starting to wonder why the others didn't spot things like this. He was walking behind Jen, though, so maybe that was why he spotted it. He paused. Kevin nearly walked into him.
What? You okay, Ethan?
Ethan was looking down at Jen's feet as she paused and looked back. Come on, guys, we need to hurry. Ethan stared at the earth under Jen's feet.
Am I the only one seeing that?
All other eyes fixed on the ground under Jen's feet. Green lines of code, like those from the Omnitrix, were spreading from where she stood. They were also going up her heel and leg on both sides. She blinked and jumped, but the second she landed, the lines reappeared. She blinked and yanked her sleeve up so she could see the Omnitrix. The lines had already spread up her arm. They were heading down towards her fingers, too. She stared for a second before looking down the collar of her shirt. Judging from the glow on her face, the code was spreading under her shirt, too. She dropped her collar and looked up at the others as the code spread up her neck. We may have a problem, but we need to keep moving. Something's happening. Gwen frowned. How do you know? Before Jen could answer, there was a mechanical whirring and the wasps were back, but they didn't move to attack. Instead, they hovered in front of them. Jen blinked at them, tilting her head as if she was listening to something the others couldn't hear. As she did, the green flooded her right eye, her pupils splitting and expanding, leaving her eye looking very much like the iconic Omnitrix symbol. Slow down! What do you mean the creator is in peril? Are you talking about Azimuth? Kevin shot a concerned look Jen's way as she kept staring at the large metal wasps. No one was talking. He blinked as he noticed that her other eye had flooded green too, but the pupil had not formed into the symbol in this one. It had simply disappeared. She went pale. Take us to him. The wasps nodded and snatched the four of them up. Ethan almost dropped his gun. Gwen stared at her cousin. What's going on? Someone's attacking this place. Don't ask me how I know, but Azimuth is here, and he's right in the line of fire. The coating hadn't faded, nor had the green from her eyes. Ethan couldn't help but stare. Kevin was in a similar state.
So, does the eye thing mean you got master control back?
Jen blinked down at her hands and seemed to think for a moment before she squinted, as if looking at something they couldn't see. Bright green lights flashed, and Gwen blinked. The wasp that had been holding Jen now held Accelerate, who grinned. Meet you there. The visor dropped, and she tapped the wasp, who dropped her, and she raced through the air, going so fast the air pressure cushioned her fall and let her race away towards the mountain the river was coming from. Closer to its source, the river was bright green, with only occasional bursts of separate colors.
Anyone want to explain what's happening?
Ethan asked, and Gwen nodded. Sure. As soon as I know what's happening, I'll let you in on it. They found the fight pretty easily. Even inside the mountain, the noise was easy to follow. They found Azimuth scrambling away from falling stalagmites. Ethan raced forward and snatched the Galvan out of the way. He scrambled back up to the others as the rocks settled. Azimuth looked up at him. Thank you, he said, and Gwen stepped forward. You should leave your cousin to her work, the first thinker insisted. Gwen frowned as the dust cleared, and she spotted what Azimuth was talking about. Vilgax was battling with forearms at the center of the cavern. It didn't look like Vilgax was too happy either, but Jen seemed stronger than ever. Ethan glanced down at the Galvan and still in his arms.
I don't mean to be rude, but who are you?
Azimuth looked him up and down critically. I was about to ask you the same question. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Gwen let out an exasperated breath. Azimuth, this is Ethan, Jen's boyfriend and fellow plumber's kid. Ethan, this is Azimuth, creator of the Omnitrix and first thinker of the Galvans. Azimuth raised what passed for his eyebrow. She's never mentioned you, he said, looking like he had a few things to say about that. Gwen raised an eyebrow at the Galvan. Since when have you taken an interest in her personal life? She asked. Kevin cut across the Galvan before he could continue, though.
Can we focus? How come Jen's fighting like Forearms has been on steroids since last time we saw her?
Azimuth nodded as they turned back to watch the fight. Vilgax was trying to use his bright yellow shield to slow her punches, so she picked him up by it and threw him into the wall.
That would be her connection to Primus.
Ethan frowned.
Who is Primus?
Azimuth shot him a judging look.
Primus is not a who. Primus is a where. This whole planet is Primus, an artificial creation of my own that holds the codon stream.
Kevin frowned.
What's a codon stream?
A crash echoed from the cavern, and a bubbling hiss became audible. They all glanced up. Vilgax had aimed a laser at Jen and missed, or she'd switched to cannon bolt at the last second because she was now the armored alien on the other side of a fissure in the ground that opened into a bubbling green stream. That is the codon stream. In the simplest terms, it is a collection of DNA data that feeds into the Omnitrix. Did you really think something the size of a wrist could hold a sample of every species DNA in the known galaxy? He didn't sound convinced that they had never thought of that. Though, to be fair, this was very new information. Azimuth shook his head and pointed at his small wrist. The device on Jennifer's wrist allows her to access the codon stream in a form that will not harm her. It makes for a simple interface. Of course, this is in no way the entire case, but it is the simplest way to explain it. Gwen rubbed the bridge of her nose. Kevin shrugged at her. Ethan frowned.
What happens if someone gets dunked in the codon stream?
I have never tried. Most likely mutation or death. Why? Ethan raced forward and Gwen glanced up, spotting the answer to Azimuth's question as Vilgax and Cannonbolt went tumbling into the fissure. Gwen cried out and reached out to catch her cousin.
If I go, you go too.
Vilgax cried out, but his hand slipped off Cannonbolt's ankle and he fell with a cry into the stream. Ethan set Azimuth down and grabbed hold of Cannonbolt's arm and began to try and heave her up. She made it back up mostly on her own power as green lights flashed around her. She was still covered in green code, but she smiled at him as he pulled her to her feet.
You okay?
Jen frowned back at the river that Vilgax had just fallen into. Gwen seemed to read her cousin's mind. You couldn't have saved him. You'd have fallen in too. Kevin nodded.
He's had it coming for years.
Azimuth shook his head. I do not know if death is inevitable. But the first thinker was cut off when a very large head began to protrude from the chasm. Ethan grabbed the Galvan as the ground under them began to crumble, and Jen transformed, this time into an alien Ethan hadn't seen before that declared itself way big, before getting straight back to fighting Vilgax. This time, though, it ended with Jen throwing Vilgax through the mountain. He sailed out of the atmosphere and disappeared as the group looked out after him. Jen nodded and transformed back into herself. Still, the circuits glowed, strong on her skin, both eyes flooded green. Azimuth hopped from Ethan's hand to Jen's shoulder and took her face in both hands, examining her with a critical eye. Fascinating. I want you to try something for me, Jennifer. Throw a shard of Tatanite. Don't transform. Just throw a shard as you would as Diamond Head. Jen frowned, but seemed to want to at least humor the Galvan. She closed her eyes and focused. She lifted a hand, and a spike of bright blue Tatanite flew from her fingers into the rock. She opened her eyes and blinked down at her hand. How did I just do that? Azimuth walked along her arm to the Omnitrix. It seems that your connection to Primus through the Omnitrix strengthens exponentially the longer you're here. How long ago did the Omnitrix teleport you and your companions here? Jen shrugged slightly. An hour or so. She grew thoughtful, and her hand, the one Azimuth wasn't currently standing on, burst into flame. She laughed. That doesn't even hurt! Azimuth nodded. It seems that this much more thorough connection has allowed you to access your alien's abilities without the need for transformation. It should wear off once you leave Primus's atmosphere. He regarded the circuits on her visible skin for a moment. I could make it permanent, if I chose to, but I don't believe you're ready. Jen nodded slightly. That, and I don't really want to go around looking like a cyberpunk makeup nightmare. Azimuth shook his head at her. Kevin couldn't help but agree. Jen looked up. And now there's a giant Vilgax out there somewhere to worry about. Asmith shook his head.
He was not exposed to the codon stream long enough for any mutation to be permanent.
Gwen frowned.
So a regular-sized Vilgax, then.
Asmith nodded and tapped out a code onto the Omnitrix before leaping off Jen's arm and stepping away from the group. I had a question. While we're here, can you... But a green glowing burst from the Omnitrix interrupted her. When the light cleared, they were standing back where they had been fighting the Technodon. The sun was peeking out from over the horizon. Fix Kevin. Jen finished lamely. Asmith had not come with them. She rolled her eyes. Yeah, no, just cut me off mid-sentence. Not like I had anything important to say. Just summon me to fight your battles, then send me home without so much as a thank you, she grumbled as the circuits faded from her skin, and the green faded back to the iris of her eye only. Ethan shook his head.
That was really rude.
He nodded, agreeing wholeheartedly with his girlfriend. Gwen shook her head.
But pretty par for the course with Asmith.
She checked her watch.
We have school in 2 hours, and Jen, you left your shoes on Primus.
Jen rubbed the bridge of her nose. It was going to be a long day. Chapter 42. Normalcy. The first month of school was blissfully peaceful. The 4 of them still patrolled, but nothing seemed so keen to attack them anymore. It was wonderful, and gave both Tennyson girls the chance to attend to their rather neglected love lives. For a few weeks, they got to act like they were normal, real people. It was great. Jen and Ethan headed out for Max's fishing spot one Sunday night after a particularly good movie. They liked to come out here and watch the stars. Ethan seemed a bit more nervous than usual, though, and Jen frowned. Is everything okay? Ethan nodded and stuck his hand in his pocket.
Yeah, everything's great.
Jen smiled, but it was just a touch forced. Because it's been quiet? Ethan turned to her, determination in his eyes.
No, because I'm with you.
He took a deep breath.
I know life with you is usually crazy, but there isn't anywhere else I'd rather be. You are so important to me. I love you.
She blinked at him, but he kept going.
And I know you're super famous in space and could probably do way better than me. And I know I don't have fancy plumber training and I'm not all that useful in a fight.
He was cut off as Jen grabbed his face and kissed him, with the same intensity she had the first time, when she'd been convinced she was about to die in a fight with Vilgax. I love you too, she whispered back as she broke the kiss. He smiled and pulled her back in for another. When they both pulled back to breathe, his smile was dazzling. He pulled his hand out of his pocket.
I know this is pretty fast, but I wanted to give you this.
He held out the small velvet box, and Jen blinked at him. He opened it, revealing a silver band. In the center sat an oval-shaped emerald, surrounded by a single ring of diamonds. She stared.
We don't have to make it official right away. I mean, we have to wait till we're 18 anyway, but I wanted to show you that I'm not going anywhere. As long as you'll have me.
She felt tears build in her eyes as her hands flew to her mouth. There was a pause.
So, what do you say?
Yes, she choked out and nodded. He smiled and pulled the ring out of the box. She held out her hand and he slipped it on her finger. Then he pulled her in for another kiss. They spent the rest of the night out under the stars, enjoying each other's company. They did decide to keep this new development to a select few people. Kevin just grinned and shook his head at them. Gwen was ecstatic, knowing that everything in her cousin's life moved very quickly. She hadn't expected this quite so soon, though. Grandpa Max supported them, but insisted on them waiting until they were at least 18. What was 2 years? Victor had already known the ring had been the one he'd given to Ethan's mother when he proposed. Jen's parents were a bit more on the skeptical side, but after sitting down for a talk with Ethan, they agreed that as long as they waited, they would support their daughter's choice. Julie shrieked excitedly. I can't believe you're engaged, she giggled at Jen one day after school. Jen smiled. Ethan was at Kevin's fixing up his bike. It's not technically an engagement yet, Julie. It's just a promise that we will. Julie rolled her eyes. Jen, he gave you his mother's engagement ring. He wants to be around you for as long as you'll have him. You're basically engaged. Jen grinned down at her hand, then sneezed. Julie frowned. You okay? Jen nodded at her friend. Probably just a cold. I'll be fine. The familiar rumble of Kevin's car pulling up to the Mr. Smoothies distracted her. Jen glanced over at the car. Ethan was in the back seat, Gwen in the passenger side. For a moment, Jen thought maybe something was going on, that they would beckon her over and take off. But they left the car and ordered their smoothies. They joined Julie and Jen, and Ethan kissed her on the forehead. He frowned.
You're running a little warm. You all right?
Jen shrugged. I'll be fine. It's just a cold. Ethan frowned.
You can still get those?
Jen nodded. Yep. Last time it happened, my aliens got sick too. Heat blast turned to ice. Wild Mutt went blind. It was bad. But I'll be okay. Gwen nodded. She still remembered that time and shuddered.
Can't have been that bad,
Kevin said, glancing at his girlfriend. I mean, I wasn't that bad, but the bad guy was. Controlled bugs. Jen stated matter-of-factly. Gwen shuddered again. Jen laughed, but about halfway through it devolved into a coughing fit. Ethan rubbed her back.
You sure you're okay?
Jen nodded. Fine. You look like something's bugging you, though. You all right? Ethan frowned and nodded.
Yeah, well, my dad is heading to Mount Rushmore for a week or so. He wants me to go with him. Get some tech training in from the plumbers who are cleaning it out and moving the stuff here. I said I'd go with him.
Jen grinned. So what's the problem? Ethan frowned.
I want to stay and help you get better.
Jen laughed a bit softer this time, only coughing a little at the end. Ethan, it's a cold. I'll be fine. Go, learn things. He grinned at her and kissed her on the forehead again.
Only if you promise to rest as much as you can while you're sick.
She nodded, still grinning. Oh, you know me.
I know, that's why I'm worried.
Jen laughed and took a sip of her smoothie to quell the cough. I'll be fine. He smiled and rubbed her back. Kevin drove everyone but Julie home that night. He dropped Ethan off last. Ethan paused as he made to get out of the car.
You'll keep an eye on her?
He asked Kevin. Kevin glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He liked Ethan. He was another car guy who'd fallen for the charms of a Tennyson. He was a good shot with a plasma cannon and surprisingly calm in a fight. He nodded to him.
I'll have her back when trouble inevitably strikes.
Ethan nodded, grinning slightly.
That's all I can ask. Thanks, Kevin.
Kevin nodded as Ethan left the car and went into his house. Kevin drove off towards his own home. Gwen had a sinking feeling. Something bad was coming. She was meditating to try and figure out what was happening, but nothing was happening. She frowned to herself. She sighed and flicked through her spell book, the one Grandma Verdona had left for her a few weeks back. She paused as she spotted a time travel spell. She frowned. Maybe... She shook her head. The thought that had crossed her mind was that maybe she could stop the accident that had mutated Kevin in the first place. But they were already lucky 6-6 hadn't shot Jen directly. At least she'd recovered from the damage to the Omnitrix after Azimuth had repaired it. She frowned, running her finger down the spell. The risk of getting Jen killed in that firefight was far worse than the benefit of getting Kevin back to normal. She hoped Kevin saw it the same way. At least Ethan would definitely be on her side. She smiled slightly as she thought about Jen and Ethan. They made a good couple. Ethan kept Jen grounded. He didn't see her as the hero of 100 Worlds first. He saw her as who she was. A very human girl capable of wonderful and amazing things, but human nonetheless. They went well together. Gwen flipped the page as the feeling of dread pulled at her again, almost more insistent this time. Nothing was happening, though. She even double-checked with Pierce at HQ. It was a quiet night. She shook her head. Maybe she just needed some sleep.